Right, this is a big ask, getting me to say everything I need to say in 5 minutes, so I'll do my best. Hello everyone, welcome. You all okay? Good, yeah, interesting morning. Bit terrifying amount of information, but there you go. So on to this presentation. First of all, just to welcome you all. This is a project that is funded by the OFM-DFM, and it is looking at the overrepresentation of disabled children and young people in the looked after child population in Northern Ireland. And today this presentation is actually going to focus on their views and experiences, but I'm doing the bit where I provide you with the context to the project as a whole. So that's my aim here. So just looking briefly then at the aims and the objectives of the study. Interestingly, a lot of people think they know quite a lot about disabled children and young people, and they also think that they know a lot about them in the care system, but in fact there's very little substantive information about characteristics, total numbers, and their views and experiences. So the aim of this project really was to look at the characteristics of the disabled looked after child population, look at the key factors that led them to becoming looked after in the first place. Another element to the study was to look at the organisational arrangements. Many of you are practitioners, some of you will be involved with disabled children and young people, and you'll know from experience how complicated the organisational arrangements are. They vary across trusts and they vary across the UK as a whole. So that was another area that we were interested in looking at. We also wanted to look at their care experiences and how well their needs are met. And one of the objectives that we had was to try and establish some baseline information, something that you could all refer to as practitioners, that gave you an overview about the current position of disabled children and young people in care in Northern Ireland. So a small number of things that we had to do. As you can see, in order to answer all of those objectives, the project was actually designed in 3 phases. Phase 1 is a literature overview, so it gives you a complete overview of the law, policy, and international knowledge about disabled children. That is up on the website and available for people to look at. I think the key thing, one of the key findings that came out of that for us, was that there is no one body that houses everything. The responsibility and knowledge in the area is actually spread across a number of different departments and agencies, and sometimes this works well and sometimes this doesn't work well, and that would be one of one of the key themes that came out of that, and how difficult it is at times for people to collaborate together on this particular area. Phase 2 was a survey of social workers to profile the characteristics of disabled children and young people in care in Northern Ireland, and this involved the completion of a questionnaire, which I won't go into details with. It's quite a long questionnaire and required quite a lot of fieldwork support. Phase 3, which is what Bernie will be focusing on today, is case studies of 15 kind of selected disabled children living in out-of-home care. Note, I've just changed the terminology, looked after, out-of-home care. And these were in-depth case studies and involved reading the case file, which on face value it seems to be quite straightforward, but as all of you know, case files are numerous, hold a range of information, and sometimes none of that information has actually had one reading by one person. So it's a particularly challenging aspect to the case studies. These were also complemented by interviews with the child or young person, the birth parent or the carer, and the social worker. So you've kind of got that triangulated approach. And the other thing that took place was an interview with the senior managers in each of the trusts to really get an overview in relation to issues related to the case studies. Are you taking on from here, or do you want me to? I'll just.
Can do.
Yeah. Do you want to just go through the methods here? This is a very actually unique study. There are very few studies that capture the views and experiences of disabled children and young people who are in out-of-home care. And you can see here that we've used a range of different methods in order to do that. And some of these you'll be familiar with. The All About Me book, feelings faces, happy, sad, etc. Blank face cards that children and young people could draw their own expressions on. Symbol cards for yes, no, and thumbs up, thumbs down. The stop sign to indicate their wish to end an interview at any time. Blank paper and colouring pens, which we found some children engaged very well with, plus play and observation. So flexibility in terms of the methods used to ascertain views and experiences, and adapted to each child as the meeting took place. So I'm going to hand over to Bernie now, who's going to give you a 5-minute overview of views and
3 years of
experiences.
research. We can't cover all of the findings because this is a huge study and we had a range of perspectives, but if anyone's interested, the report is currently in review and will be published hopefully next month. And we're happy to share those. The first 2 reports are available and I'll give you the links to those at the end. So we've just picked out 4 themes, and we're only going to give you some tasters of some of the data that we have because we're still in the final stages of completing on the report. So first of all, the reflections on kinship care. We had some very positive comments from children who had grown up in kinship care or were currently still living in a kinship care placement. They described some very loving relationships with various relatives who were looking after them, and that's an example of one of the quotes from one of the girls. I was Granda's girl in the summer. I would go work with him and we would watch all the cowboy movies together. We loved all the same things. I would just always be with him. Some very happy memories they had of their time in kinship care. Kinship care also offered an opportunity to have very strong bonds with family relations beyond the initial carer, and to have a good sense of your family identity and who you are as a person, and that came through quite a bit in our data with children in kinship care arrangements. Sometimes that meant that children were reluctant to spend time away from their kinship care, especially if they had previously been in shorter placements and then ended up in kinship care. Going to a respite care placement then was sometimes difficult because they didn't want to be separated again from their kinship arrangement. And also sometimes children were reluctant to disclose when things were difficult in their kinship care placement because they felt a strong loyalty to their birth family and they wanted to stay in the placement that they had. So there were 2 of the issues that came through in terms of kinship care. And the final issue was around the support for carers. Sometimes kinship carers who were very committed to their role and had continued in their role reflected back that perhaps they weren't totally prepared for the role they were taking on and could have accessed more training and support, particularly in the early days when they were getting used to their new role in caring for a disabled child, some with very complex needs. So that's kinship care. Non-relative foster care was the other arrangement some children lived in, and equally they were very positively appraised by children, by the social workers that were involved in their cases, and by the carers that we interviewed, and indeed the birth parents of children who were in non-relative foster care placements. And there's some quotes to show that. It's cool here, come in and we've lots of food in the house. So very positive comments from them. And they also, whilst living in non-relative foster care, quite often had very positive contact with birth family still, and that was sometimes arranged with the assistance and support from the foster care, which was noted quite a bit in some of our interviews. And that's a social worker explaining that. The foster family have taken him under their wing and they love him and they just think the world of him. Ever since day one, the foster carers agreed to mum coming down for contact to their home once a week, and between them they've created a good bond. It's always been so positive. So it's a good example of really close partnership working between the foster care, the birth parent, the social worker, and supporting that child. Sometimes children found it difficult to settle in foster care placements, and particularly if they were in repeated short-term placements, whilst there was an effort to secure a more longer-term placement. And some of the professionals we interviewed highlighted that in particular, that it was difficult to secure alternative out-of-home care for disabled children and young people, and that's a quote really to illustrate that. We're finding it extremely difficult to recruit the kind of foster carers that we need to look after these children. It is an area we're going to have to work really hard on, and that was one of the main themes around seeking suitable non-relative foster care placements for these children. Residential care was the other setting, and we had some children who were in specialist settings, and those were children with much higher levels of need and more complex impairments, and sometimes challenging behaviours that presented a risk to themselves or to other people. Sometimes they were out of area, quite often they were in a different trust, and occasionally they were actually outside Northern Ireland as well, so there were implications for their contact with family. Mainstream residential care was highlighted as being unsuitable for many of the disabled children in our sample, and one of the young people we interviewed explains this in terms of the impact of noise and group dynamics in that setting for her, and also there were issues around the training of staff and their understanding of her impairment-related needs. So because of my ASD, I don't really like all this noise, I can't control this, I don't like it, all the staff do is push my buttons, I like my routine, I like knowing what I'm doing and when and how I'm going to do it. I don't like when someone ruins it, like they always try and change the rules in here. I don't mind the rules, but if you're going to change them, they might sit down when I come in and tell me, like, stopping my routine is not how it works. And there was a whole story behind that case about her behaviour in that home that was linked back to this very eloquently stated reason. The second theme is around permanency and change, and unfortunately in our survey approximately a third of our disabled children had experienced placement change, and for some that was very frequent. We had one boy who'd had over 10 placement moves in 1 year, so for some children this is a real feature of their lives. Sometimes it's moving across different short-term placements, or experiencing placement breakdown, or going home, going into kinship care, going into non-relative care and then going back home again. But it involved a lot of other changes for young people. It meant sometimes being quite a distance from your home, it meant changing school, it meant getting used to new children, new carers, new surroundings, so that implications beyond their initial care arrangement. This is a quote from a 16-year-old who talked about all the time she moved, and she said I was shipped around an awful lot. And a younger child we interviewed drew a picture of some of the homes she'd lived in, and you can see her trajectory from her first birth home right up to where she was now. The little house in the background is the parenting assessment unit. So these are my houses. First my mummy and daddy's house, then my granny's, then a foster care, then we went to another foster care, then a wee flat, and now at my daddy's house. So lots of movement for some of the children, which really had implications for them. Getting there. Participation, I think it would be remiss of us not to mention participation given some of the themes in today's conference and the fact that we made such efforts to engage with disabled children in this study. And they reported a range of experiences. Some of them were really involved in decisions, attended LAC reviews. Social workers made great efforts to consult them with alternative methods before LAC reviews and after. Other examples where it was much more limited and there really needed to be more effort to engage and consult with disabled children. Some of them had situations where they felt their choices were more limited, but sometimes understood why because of a particular situation or context, and that's a quote really to explain that. Moving from my last placement was my own decision, because my social worker wanted me to stay there, but that was my own decision. Moving from my kinship care, I didn't have a choice, but there wasn't much space, so I sort of had to move. So they understood some of the reasons why sometimes choice is restricted, but still wanted to be consulted. And our final theme is around access to advocacy and therapeutic support. Unfortunately, none of the disabled children in our case studies had access to independent advocacy, which was worrying. And very limited access to therapeutic support amongst our survey sample and our case study sample as well. And that's in the context of children who've experienced much trauma, lots of separation, lots of placement moves, but yet had very little therapeutic input. And they really emphasised the importance of being listened to, telling their story, and having that response from a consistent relationship with their social worker or another professional. And one of the reasons for that was around other experiences they had beyond their care experience, and bullying was one of the ones that they talked quite a bit about. And to give you an example of the long-term impact of bullying, this was one of the young people we interviewed explained, bullying is something that's populated my entire existence. We told the school they didn't do anything, they said it was just kids having a laugh, but those years have been the torment of my life. Some people might have good lives and plenty of friends and they'd be more sociable, and then there's another life for people who've got bullied so long that their whole life and existence was nothing. which is a very stark statement, I think, about the long-term impact that had on that young person who didn't have access to therapeutic support. So to conclude, please do wait for the full report. There's lots more detail in it, lots more information from professionals and from the birth parents and carers. I suppose what we're saying today is that disabled children have unique experiences of being in care, and they need to be recognised as a distinct group within the care population, both in terms of collecting data on that population and ascertaining their experiences and meeting their needs. Some very positive examples of kinship and non-relative foster care, but unfortunately in our survey we found they were less likely to have family-based care, more likely to have residential care than non-disabled children. The challenges of living in mainstream residential care are really important for us to pay attention to, and the issue around permanency and stability with those placement changes. I've talked about participation, and I think we can make a lot more effort to think about alternative communication and ways to engage with disabled children as part of our routine reviews of our placements for children and our care planning processes. And obviously we need to increase our advocacy and therapeutic support. And finally, a message for researchers in the room is that we need more research. This is the first study in Northern Ireland that looked at this population, and we really need lots more research around this population, including their experiences of child protection systems, their experiences of short breaks, and those on the edge of care as well.
I'm Catherine McGuire, and I'm a area manager with the Probation Board, currently working in Hydebank Wood College and South Belfast. And I'm going to tell you about a study that I undertook over the last year while completing the research methods for a social work course at Ulster. I suppose I'm always aware as a social worker within justice that the wider social work community, maybe I'm assuming wrongly, might know a lot about our context or what we do in that particular context. So I'm going to start by talking very quickly through the policy context and research, just to give you a brief background on that. As part of the devolution, part of the Hillsborough Agreement that led to the devolution of policing and justice in Northern Ireland, a prison review was established, led by Dame Anne Orrs. It reported 2011 made 40 recommendations for change and described young adult offenders as a forgotten group who had much less media, academic or political attention than the women that they shared the sites with. And the Orrs review recommended that in relation to young adults that a community-based pilot project be set up for young adult offenders in the community. Long story short, a business case was put together by Probation Board, who were the lead in this recommendation, that went to DOJ, but there was no money. So there were great plans for a project in the Greater Belfast area. So we ended up running a much smaller pilot study. And I started this course with the intention of evaluating that, but the numbers were so small that there was nothing to they weren't significant enough to do anything with. So took a step back from it and thought, well, what do we actually know about the resettlement outcomes for young men in Northern Ireland? And actually very little. So that's, I suppose, where this study came from. In terms of the research and literature that's already available in terms of resettlement and preventing reoffending, the desistance research has kind of been the dominant paradigm within probation over the last 15 years. The initial research was done by Shad Marina and Stephen Farrell, and then applied to social work practice within the justice context by Fergus McNeill and Strathclyde. Bottoms and Shaplin's Sheffield desistance study focused on young adults and desistance. And I suppose one of the key things that they found was that some of the static risk factors that we think of in terms of reoffending, for example, number of previous convictions, did predict further offending, but that situational factors predicted it over and above the static factors. And they suggested that young adults' steps towards desistance are mediated by their disposition and the availability of social capital. And I suppose it was the availability of social capital, both bridging and bonding, provided by the family and the community, that I was particularly interested in, and started to think, well, what are the barriers to accessing social capital for the young adults that we work with? I suppose also just to kind of say that, you know, it's now accepted that young adulthood is a distinct life stage, and that the transition from adolescent to adulthood takes much longer than maybe we would have thought of in the past, and that really we need to think about it from sort of late teens through to mid to late 20s in terms of how people make that transition. And that young people who have had experience of time in a structured environment like a prison, those processes are delayed, and that impacts on their journey towards desistance as well. Okay, so I looked at a range of static factors. I'm just going, oh, forgot about my aim. Okay, the aim of the study was to identify factors contributing to the resettlement of 18 to 21-year-old males in Northern Ireland. And I have lost my methodology slide somehow, but it'll be in the one that was out in the end.
That's okay.
So it was, I undertook a quantitative retrospective study, reviewed 162 cases of young adults released between March 2011 and April 2014. There's obviously a huge range of variables that will impact on resettlement, so I had to select particular variables to focus on. So I looked at a range of static factors, accommodation, employment, community and substance use as independent variables, and recall to custody as the dependent variable. And I suppose if we kind of think about opportunities to develop and access social capital, being back in custody is a major barrier to that. I developed a data extraction tool to collect data from agency records, including pre-sentence and other reports, risk assessments and records of contact. Ethical approval was sought and gained through the university and through PBNI, and data analysis was undertaken using SPSS. Major move out of a comfort zone for me, who hadn't done anything like that since O-level maths, so that was quite a while ago. In terms of thinking about the static risk factors and thinking about what might be of interest to, I suppose, the wider social work community, I looked at age of first known criminality, and that's a key criminological variable in the identification of life course persistent offending. The Bottoms and Chaplin study that I referred to, that was a longitudinal study, and they had included an early disadvantage score in their research, and they found that the early disadvantage score related strongly to the age of first known conviction, suggesting that those who offend early are more likely to have experienced adversity in childhood. And when I look at, when I cross-tabulated that with recall to custody, you can see that those who with first known criminality between the ages of 10 and 14, that 66% were recalled to custody, and you can see that the percentage recall decreases as the age of first known criminality increases. I know there's been a lot of work done in terms of multiple adversity in childhood. Gavin, you've been involved in some of that in terms of looking at outcomes later in life. I didn't look at that in particular, but this is maybe an indication that that requires further inquiry within the justice sector. And there was a statistically significant relationship to recall in terms of age of first known criminality. I looked at risk. Probation officers in Northern Ireland complete two types of risk assessment. There are other risk assessments as well, but the two main ones that we complete are the ACE tool, which helps us to assess likelihood of reoffending within the next 2 years. Probation officers will score various dynamic risk factors in relation to that, and will use their professional judgment to give weighting to particular information. And we will also assess a risk of serious harm. So of the 162 cases I looked at, 14% were assessed as risk of serious harm. And you'll see there that the percentage of recall was higher for those assessed as a high likelihood of reoffending. That, I suppose, shouldn't surprise us, because I suppose, you know, they're likely to be maybe more difficult to engage and have more risk factors. But almost over a third of those who were assessed as a high likelihood of reoffending weren't recalled to custody. So that's a group we need to look at in more detail to understand, you know, what was it that was different about that group that they actually managed to stay in the community and comply with the licence conditions. You still with me?
Yeah.
Okay. I looked at community as well, and that's a quote at the top there from an American criminologist, that I suppose if we are to define resettlement as reintegration, we need to consider measures of attachment to a variety of social institutions. So I was looking for evidence of involvement in a range of social institutions. I looked at faith communities, sport, youth groups, and whether or not the young people in the sample were involved in any of those pre-custody. At the pre-sentence report stage, there was no recorded involvement in community activities in 84% of cases. Now, we can't assume from that the young adults weren't involved in any community activities, but that probation officers weren't recording them at that point in time. And I suppose that for me raises questions about probation staff's understanding of social capital and its role in terms of supporting resettlement and desistance. The most frequently recorded activity was sport, and 18 young adults were involved in sport.
Just a couple more minutes.
Oh dear. I also looked at the number who'd been subject to threat or punishment at the pre-sentence report stage, and almost a quarter had been at that threatened, and only 4% were unable to return to their community of origin. Employment, education and training, I'll draw your attention to a few kind of key factors there. 83% of the sample were not involved in education, training or employment at the point that the pre-sentence report was completed. The figures for the general population within this timescale and for this age range were 25%. I find that quite shocking, I have to say, that there was such a high percentage of those not in employment, training and education. Accommodation. Pre-custody, most young people were living with family, and that not surprises given this age range. And most returned to family post-custody. The recall rates for those who went to temporary accommodation, so that will be probation approved premises or homelessness, hostels, any kind of temporary accommodation, is significantly higher than for those who went to permanent accommodation with family. Alcohol and drug use were a factor in the index offence of 88% of cases. And I suppose, without going through the detail, because I'm aware of the time, in relation to the alcohol and drug use, the kind of finding in relation to the young adult group was that those who had a high problem score as related on ACE with alcohol weren't at a significant risk of being recalled. Those who had drugs alone, it wasn't as significant, but it was the combined high alcohol, high drug use that were most significant in terms of recall to custody. I undertook a statistical technique called binomial logistic regression, which I'd never even heard of a year ago. And it's really a statistical model that sort of you basically throw in all your variables, and then the SPSS identifies those that are predictive of recall. The most strongly predictive was accommodation at release, followed by a number of previous convictions, and that's what I was saying about that combined high alcohol and drug use. 47% of the sample were recalled to custody. That compares to, I suppose, the percentage for all recalls is 33%. So for the young adult group, that's much higher. And 12% were subject to more than one recall. Longer term drug and alcohol interventions that are responsive to needs of young adults produce better outcomes, and we need to look at those arrangements. The role of the community, I think there's an issue for all of us in terms of how we engage with communities to support young people to access and develop social capital. Next steps, further research is required in relation to social work understanding of the concept of social capital and the value of social interventions. Martin Webber, I think in York, has completed some research in terms of accessing social capital for people who have experience of mental health. I didn't locate research in any other area of social work practice, that kind of looks at the value of social capital and the development of social interventions, but it would seem appropriate to this. The role of families in supporting resettlement needs to be looked at. What are their needs and how are they best supported? There are various, I'm getting there, Gavin, almost there. Our experience in Hydebank has been that there are a range of projects out there to support families where there is a child under 18, but there are very few projects out there that will work with the families of young adults. Probation Board has a funding application in at the minute to try and develop a pilot to support the parents and families of young adults where they're returning home post-custody, but also to look at, can we engage with families at an earlier stage to build capacity and resilience within those families so that those young people can actually return home rather than going to temporary accommodation. And the challenges of cross-departmental working. I mean, I suppose some of the findings from the study in terms of the levels of exclusion from employment, training and education at the point of sentencing, accommodation are obviously beyond justice. But I suppose I find myself thinking recently about do we wait on our departments to kind of take the lead, or as a social work community can we start to poke holes in those silo walls lower down?
Right.
Okay.
Thanks. So again, just if you have any questions, keep a note of them, and we'll hopefully have a wee bit of time at the end.
My name's Diane Boyle. I'm delighted to hear Catherine speaking because her and I were both on the research methods course and lived to tell the tale. I did this research course and service evaluation while working as senior practitioner for, at the time it was social work with older people in Carrickfergus Integrated Care Team. So what is gerontological social work? I was looking at the roles and tasks of essentially specialist social work with older people. I just used the big title in a way to sort of say, like, we should be proud of what we do. We are a specialist service. So I'll run very quickly through with you the whistle-stop tour of why I carried this out, the methods, findings, conclusions. So you may have seen these sort of memes on Facebook, a bit of a joke with the jag. Why did I do this? Well, what is social work? There's a whole raft of images there of what people think social work is. And for me, it was the one on the bottom right, the social worker turning her hair out at the computer, what I really do. And this is where I started getting into bridging the gap between research and practice, supervising staff and as a practitioner, and just thinking, I'm hearing I don't do social work anymore all the time. What's going on? So I began to do a literature review, and this big term, neoliberalism, but it's basically what has been getting in the way of social work for this time with older people. And that was essentially looking at government policy over the last 20 to 30 years. Has been all about market principles and audits and inspections and data returns. That has been impacting against social work, and there's not enough money, as no surprise to anybody. And this was shown like across the board, different countries, even north and south of Ireland, budgetary restraints holding back social work with older people, and rafts of change, IT systems, restructuring, you name it, it was all coming our way. And a growing sense of deprofessionalisation that social workers were feeling, then they didn't have the freedom to use their own knowledge, skills and values and do their job well. They were curtailed by bureaucracy. The literature review then is quite sad reading, showing social work with older people experience a loss of identity, role erosion, and job satisfaction hitting the floor, and sadly people leaving the profession again across the Western world there. So it's quite depressing. On one hand, reassuring it's not just us in the Northern Trust. So not all bad news. So the readings and the writers who are out there are really looking at the rise and fall of the profession. We're saying this is a time of opportunity, and for social workers it's about taking ownership of our profession again, social work with older people particularly. The College of Social Work made an excellent business case before they disappeared, but they pulled together really a vast body of evidence to show that social work with older people is extremely effective. And the conclusions really, if we're going to fight back, what we need is more research into social work with older people, greater education at university to say this is a genuine part of social work. It's not the Cinderella sister, it is a true service. And role clarification. So role clarification is where I came in. I wanted to see in the Northern Trust and our integrated care teams, what were we doing? Clarify our own role. We should know what we're doing. Sometimes we feel like we don't. And then give us evidence to help articulate our role and help speak to our managers who are very often not social workers. So we're coming with something concrete, which is why I got on the course. So I will look to evaluate the social work service and Friedman's model. How much are we doing? How well are we doing it? And is anyone better off? Sounds so simple now, but posing the question was a challenge. So there was just me, a few hours released from work, so I thought I have to take a sample of cases. I would love to have been able to speak to service users and social workers. I couldn't manage it all, so I was able to sample 100 social work cases across the trust, and I took a mixture of band 7 and 6 caseloads. So that was our senior practitioners and our regular social workers on the teams. And I made sure that I represented every locality, so it's a huge trust. So we were going from Newton Abbey to Ballycastle, across. And we gathered, I gathered, I wish it was we, it was me. I gathered an awful lot of information then about the needs of the service users and carers we were meeting, what goals they had, what kind of outputs and outcomes were going on. I had a huge data set. And then specifically looked at the roles the social workers were carrying out. I had this massive task then, what are the roles of a social worker? This is the beginning of a data tool I designed. I looked at what service users were saying they wanted from social workers, what government policy was saying social workers should be doing, what professional bodies were saying social workers were doing, tried to meld it all together and ended up with a sort of key list of roles. So we have assessment, care planning, roles within the assessment process, ongoing casework, complexity, conflict, psychological frailty. Just fly through these, but roles around safeguarding, risk management, early intervention, court work, crisis response, values roles, this promoting independence and autonomy, working as a guide and an enabler being a massive part of that, helping people with decision making and transitions as they hit illness and loss in older life. And then sadly, but very necessarily, an awful lot of administrative roles. Social workers in the Northern Trust carry out the care management function, so a lot of very necessary roles there. Acting as a gatekeeper to the resource, providing practical support, working with families, working with other agencies and disciplines, and working along with carers. So quite a broad range of roles there. And then I wanted to actually talk to the social workers and hear from them, asking them really about how well we did things and what were the outcomes. So was there other work they would have liked to have carried out? Did they feel the work was important? Did they feel the work was effective? What helped them and hindered them? What kind of outcomes did they feel they were getting? So it was limited, there was only me. It was a very small sample size. Out of 2,834 cases, I only managed 100. And I could have been biasing the process as a member of staff within the Northern Trust, was very conscious of that. And findings and outcomes in that were quite limited because the social work involvement was ongoing in these cases. They weren't closed cases, it was active work within the Trust. And it was only the social worker's perspective. I'd really love to redo this with the service user perspective and the carer's perspective. Ended up with a huge data set of needs and goals of our service users, which for us in the Northern Trust will be useful. But the good finding was that the social workers were delivering on all those range of roles, and quite surprised, I think, when they saw in black and white how much they were actually doing. But it was about, is it making any difference? Or are we doing it well? Social workers were asked, is there other roles you would have liked to have carried out? 27 times the answer was yes. Social workers were wanting to do more therapeutic work, and they were finding sadly that lack of time was preventing them from doing that. So what was holding them back? What were the hindrances and barriers to carrying out their work effectively? There was a raft of answers, and distress, this wasn't a tick list exercise for the social workers, this was just case by case. In this case, tell me what hindered you or held you back. I've clumped them together into themes here for you, but you can see their paperwork and bureaucracy. Arlene, you'll know this well. Huge number of instances where that was holding the social workers back. Budgetary constraints, lack of time. Then there was a few other things gathered together there, issues with service users or carers, other professionals. That included things maybe where somebody didn't have capacity to engage with the social worker, or there was conflict within the family, or a care agency maybe letting people down. Lots of minor issues there. And a worrying one at the end, 14 instances where social workers felt their professional judgment was being contested by their managers. So we've seen a lot of evidence of what was in the literature review sadly showing up with our social workers. Okay, so what helped them? Again, it wasn't a tick box exercise, it was case by case. What helped you with your work to be effective? And interestingly, the top three things was the social worker themselves. They saw their own knowledge, their own values, their own skills was the biggest help to them in doing their job, alongside supervision. And then the next clump of things is all about relationship, where the social workers had a good relationship with their service users, carers, other professionals or disciplines. That's what helped them to do their job. And some other factors there as well, but just it's quite a striking return in that. And did the social workers feel they were making a difference in their service users' lives? And they didn't feel they were doing real social work anymore when I started talking to them, but as we went through cases they did realise actually they did feel they were making a difference. they would like to have done more, but they were able to quote examples in every case where they had a positive impact. Number one being helping people to be maintained at home, which for us in older people's services is the main goal. Let's try and keep people out of hospital and out of care homes. Supporting people through change, decision makings and transitions, a raft of things there, but there were good outcomes, which was good news given all the hindrances were in the way. So the conclusions, we have a really good social work service in the Northern Trust I'm very, very proud of. Met some fabulous social workers. They're confident and competent to do their job, but they are being held back. They are being held back by the budgetary constraints and paperwork and all the things that the literacy review identified. Yet they're still managing to deliver outcomes, which is effective outcomes, which is great. But they could be used to better effect, and we need to look at reducing bureaucracy and allowing more professional discretion. So those were my recommendations to the Trust, just to try and find ways to take steps to take away from this deprofessionalisation that seems to have crept into the profession, value and respect the judgments of social workers, find ways to make better use of the social work resource. So that will be trying to reduce bureaucracy, trying to delegate tasks out maybe that could be done by administrative workers, keep working on our IT systems, avoiding these manual data returns and things that are using up precious social work time. And then recognising as well there are contradictions. This was another theme you can read about more in the study, but there are a lot of contradictions. One hand, we're meant to do early intervention and support people, but on the other hand, we can't get funding for those types of interventions because they're not deemed as critical needs. So acknowledging those contradictions in policy. And lastly, looking for an outcome still. We don't really know if we're doing a good job or not. I've done this study, but we need to get feedback from every instance where we're meeting with a service user or carer to see, is this making a difference for you? So next steps for me is just continuing to share my message. I know time is short today, and hopefully we'll affect some change.
Okay, so I'm going to very quickly give you an overview of a pilot project that's being run in the Western Health and Social Care Trust of the Growing Child Parenting Programme. I'm sorry, my name is Helga Snedden. I run ACCOMMODATION. The other two people that are named on the slide are Pauline McClenaghan, who's the Chief Executive of the Life Start Foundation, and Deirdre Mahan, who's Head of Safeguarding Children in the Western Health and Social Care Trust. And this is a project where they are trying to mainstream delivery within statutory services of an evidence-based programme. So rather than having social workers case manage and refer out for delivery of this programme by voluntary and community agency, by Life Start, they're actually training some of the family support workers within the social work teams to deliver the programme. So in case you're not familiar with the Growing Child, it's an evidence-based parenting programme. It just had a randomised controlled trial of effectiveness completed there. I think the results came out last year. And it showed that it is very effective at reducing levels of parenting stress and increasing parenting knowledge about child development and how to support it. And it's showing promising results in improving child outcomes. It's a home-based delivery programme, and it involves a trained family visitor going out and working one-on-one with the family once a month over about 5 years usually. They like to start it around birth or as early as possible, because we know that's a really important time in child development and parenting behaviour, and then continue it on normally up until the child's 5 years old. So you get that crossover into education, so the parent doesn't get to 4 years, hand over the education of their child to the schools, but they continue to have the support after that. It's a structured based programme, so it is manualised, and every month the home visitor, the family support worker, goes out and talks to the parent about their child's development at that age and gives them ideas and resources of how to support that. And as I've said, the pilot in the Western area is to try this through a different delivery model and through the social work teams, the family support workers, to vulnerable families. So a couple of things, when you're scaling up an evidence-based programme, there are some things to consider, obviously, apart from the evidence base and the match with the needs of the client group. You have to look at whether it is ready to scale and whether it's ready to mainstream. They're two slightly different processes. So just to flag a couple of things about Growing Child, it is structured. So there is a manual, there is a training infrastructure, there is a supervision process by Life Start that helps maintain fidelity and quality control. But this is being trained to be delivered by a new professional group. So this is quite different. If you think about family support workers, this is quite different type of work compared to the usual type of contact visits that they might have with families. Training and supervision is provided by LifeStart, which again is something quite unusual, having a voluntary and community agency training statutory staff to deliver a programme and then provide that ongoing support is a different way of working compared to the usual referral out process. Resources and timescales. It was decided in the Western area that there would be 20% of the family support workers' time allocated to help deliver the LifeStart Growing Child programme. So they're doing other things as well, these staff. And when you think about the type of setup in a lot of social work teams, not all of those staff are full time, and they already come to this programme with a pretty full week's work anyway, doing contact visits and things like that. So there are issues around resources and timescales. And the other consideration, which is where I come into the process, is that they decided, because this was a new way of working and they're trying to mainstream the programme, they wanted to capture the learning around implementation. So how do you actually get it to work in practice and change that professional practice at the front line, as well as look at the effectiveness of the programme. So is it as effective in improving outcomes for this group of families being delivered in this way as has been shown in the previous RCTs? So the framework that we're using to look at implementation, we're doing two types of research in this project, and I'll not bore you with all the methodology. One is a piece of action research. So we gather evidence as we go along and I feed it back to the steering group. So if they have a decision to make, I go off and find them information, talk to key stakeholders and bring it back so it can be discussed. The other thing then is we're supporting the frontline practitioners, the family support workers, to gather the outcomes information as part of the routine monitoring. So we've selected some of the most predictive tests that were used in the previous evaluation, and we've trained those family support workers up to administer them at the start and the end of engagement. So the framework that we're using to look at implementation, these are all factors that were identified from a big meta-analysis done by Dean Fixon and Karen Blase a number of years ago. If you haven't looked at them before, if you sent me an email, I'll drop you some information on it. But basically, when you're changing professional practice, these are some of the key drivers that have been shown to be particularly influential in making evidence-based programs and evidence-based practices effective. And they fall into three areas: so organisational drivers, leadership drivers, and competency drivers. And there's skills or areas that you look at under each of these. I'll not go into any more detail than that, other than for the process evaluation, this is what I'm looking at progress against to see if there are any strengths or weaknesses in what's happening. The competency driver down the left hand side of the triangle, so the coaching, the training and the selection, you would expect with most evidence-based programs that are ready to scale up. They're not all ready to scale up, even if they've got good evidence, but for most of them that are ready to scale up, that you would have strong supports there for coaching, training and selection. And that is something that was seen with the LifeStart pilot. Where we're having the difficulty over the last year in getting this up and running is on the two other sides of the triangle. So actually getting the support within the statutory system, so the right people to know about the programme, getting the referral pathways set up, getting the staff freed up from their other responsibilities to go and deliver the programme, and then a wee bit around the leadership drivers as well, which has been particularly important because having buy-in from the very senior managers like Deirdre, even though they're very well respected, will only take you so far in creating professional change. And social work is so disparate. There are so many different teams and there are so many different locations within the system. It has taken a lot of time to try and get the support behind that to get the thing up and running. Now I put this up because the pilot's been up and running for about a year now, and it is at the stage of delivery, so they do have families that meet the criteria engaging in the programme. It has been a lot slower than they were expecting. And I thought this was quite a useful graph or figure for showing you what a lot of the process has been over the last year around communication and buy-in. When I think of Pauline and Deirdre, it's a bit like, do you remember David Carradine in Kung Fu in the 70s, where he was walking along with his backpack talking to all these different people? That's basically what a lot of this process has been. Trying to find the influencers within the system, make them aware of the programme, get them to a stage where they understand the referral the pathways, and they think it's a good idea for their families, and they've bought into the process. And I think at this we're probably somewhere around 5 and 6. So the cases are starting to filter through, but we're not at that stage of it's mainstreamed into statutory services and they have ownership over it. So what has worked so far from the implementation side of things? Identifying the core components of the programme at the very start. Now this is an evidence-based programme, and when you go to mainstream or scale up, you have to have a really good understanding of what makes that effective and what you can mess with and what you really can't, what you have to have maintained within that. So right at the very start, when we sat down with the steering group, we said it has to be one key worker. Okay, you need that relationship built over time. If you are going to change key workers with these families, what the evidence is showing us is that it has to be a planned transition. And that immediately was, that might not be possible. It's like, well, how do we make that possible? Because that's one of the core components of the programme. Another thing was the regularity of the visits. So it's a very strong tenet of this programme that is regular visits every month. Now again, with caseloads and workloads within those teams, that took a bit of negotiation to try and make that workable. Identifying a clear implementation plan with timescales and responsibilities. This project started off with an advisory group, and very quickly into the process, when they were planning to meet quarterly and feedback on progress, we thought, no, this actually needs to be a steering group. We need to have a discussion about who is in this room and what decisions you're responsible for, what data you need coming into this that will help you make informed decisions, and also what you're responsible for doing when you leave the room. And having the implementation plan with the timescales and the targets has been very helpful then for monitoring progress as well. The strong leadership at different levels already flagged that in terms of you need to implement change effectively. You need it at lots of different levels. That's from the senior staff who can release the resources, who can give the mandate for the change, but also within those individual teams. And one of the things that we talked about was, well, who are making the decisions about making referrals to these families? How can we involve this in this process? So we've got things like discussions at the assistant directors meetings in social work, and feeding in some of the behaviour or the progress reports through the team health checks that are happening anyway. So the right people who can influence the process are actually engaging with the programme. Engagement is critical. This is usually voluntary delivered, non-stigmatising programme with families. Putting that in to be delivered by family support workers is a different dynamic. So that has been, there's been learning there in the project around how social work teams explain this type of support, and then how the families are actually going to engage in it too. And I think when we do the outcomes evaluation, we're planning to go out and talk to the families and see how this type of support has fitted with them and how they have felt working with the family support workers as well. I've already said about identifying where decisions are actually made. Quite often you get very senior people in a steering group who are 2 steps away from what's happening on the front line. So it has taken quite a lot of work to trickle that through the system and identify who's making the decisions. And that feeds in with ongoing communication and feedback loops. I would say, as a completely unbiased researcher who's doing the research, but the action research, what people have said about that is it's been a helpful resource because I'm independent. So I can sit in a meeting and I can ask really stupid questions in a way that the delivery agent or the teams mightn't be able to do. And we've also, because I've gone and done electronic surveys and telephone surveys and attended some of the meetings and looked at it against the implementation framework, it has helped move the discussions in that steering group away from hypothetical or individual cases, which seems to be a big issue in social work meetings that I've attended, where they like to talk about individual cases and not necessarily the summary of what's going on. And I don't think there would have been the resource in the existing system to have gathered that information otherwise, because some of it's new, it's not what's already collected within the normal monitoring information.
Just a minute or so.
All right. The challenges are competing priorities. So I said at the start, the 20% of the family support workers' time, all of those family support workers had existing caseloads, existing work to do. And things like geographical boundaries and where people are located and where the referrals are coming from, those have all taken time to try and work through, and we are still working through it in the project. Setting the eligibility criteria, so even though it's all children under the age of 1 who are at risk or who have care experience parents, what we're finding is a lot of the professionals are not referring eligible cases, and it might be because they have other supports going into them or their family, their needs are too complex. And I think there's a debate to be had there whether it's prevention or intervention work or whether it's like a step down support, because there is a tension in this pilot of having to keep cases open because the family support workers are delivering the support. And if you keep cases open in social work, then there are monitoring and there are lots of other things, and I think that's something that we'll have a meeting about it next week to try and untangle. If you weren't mainstreaming this, if it had been set up as a project where they were case managing it out, making a referral out for LifeStart to deliver, it would probably have more people involved in it at this stage. But it's specifically because we're trying to mainstream the delivery that it's throwing up some of these challenges. And it does just take time and effort to change professional practice. Just to conclude, what I would see as the most important things out of that is to plan and track implementation carefully. If you looked at this pilot project and you thought what it would take to get off the ground would be organising training for the family support workers and freeing up the time for them to see the families, it's only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the work, raising awareness, getting buy-in, getting engagement, selling it to the families, and that all takes time and effort. Is
Great.
that?
Thanks very much.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Newton McAndrew, Health and Social Care Board. It's a question for Karen and Burling. I'm struck by the point that you were making, Karen, about it's difficult to get collaboration around children with disabilities and families with children with a disability. And I was wondering, we've now got the new statutory duty to cooperate. And my question is there anything from your research that could point us in a direction that we could think about how we make that happen, better collaboration, and use the legislation to help us? There might not be. If there was, I'd be interested.
If we'd had that question before,
Yeah.
we could
Well,
have,
you can
but we
email it
can,
tonight.
yeah, or if you email it to us,
Okay.
that would be really helpful.
Yeah.
The key issue being that responsibility sits across a number of departments, a number of people within those departments who each of them has a commitment, but it's the collaborative nature of the commitment that strikes sometimes as difficult to achieve. But I think we would appreciate if you sent that question to us, because obviously we're keen that what the research does is then actually feedback into practice development, and I think we would look at that in the light of the findings. It's a big document, and I know you can appreciate.
But there is data on, I think that one of the issues is that the field social worker has the statutory responsibility, so it's how that social worker then communicates with the children with disabilities team, with the health professionals, the school, and with everyone else involved with the child. And there would be data in our report that would help
There is.
offer some indications of what children think they need and they want, and what families need and want. Early intervention being a key theme around that.
Okay. Any Yeah.
Arlene Garden of Social Strategy, and obviously involved at the beginning stages of that, Bernie. What did you end up with? I know there was a lot of debate around who would be included, who wouldn't, and how you would identify people. What sort of range of young people, children, young people, did you end up with to consult with, as in the level of disabilities?
Yeah. In our survey, we had over 300 disabled children living in the fully looked after childcare system, and then we had another group who were looked after because of extensive use of short breaks. And so these were children who had been diagnosed with a cognitive, physical, sensory disability or mental health need. And then we had another group who didn't have a diagnosis but had been assessed as having a disability and mental health related needs. So they were more the borderline group, which I know a lot of the trusts had an interest in including, and we did capture some of those. In fact, a number of the ones, for example, the young person in a residential home would be one of those who was only diagnosed in early adolescence, but there had been consistent concerns about her disability needs throughout her life. So we have captured that borderline group, as well as a group who are more severe and complex needs at the other end as well. And we are planning to go out to trusts. All the trusts helped us with this project, so over the next year we'll be hopefully coming around with involved teams that can work with us.
Any other questions to the other presenters, maybe? A couple of reflections, just that, I mean, from Catherine and Diane, the importance of the research methods, of course, even though it's an Ulster, the importance of it to the profession is central. It's great. It's great to see that. And Elga, I don't know. I mean, you probably this is probably I don't know how you manage your frustration around that, but the gap between the evidence and seeing that in practice. I mean, we are moving towards it, aren't we? But we're not there yet. So I don't know if you want to say anything more about that.
I think it's really difficult to choose what bit of the evidence is most translatable into practice. You know, there's a lot of discussion around evidence-based programs because they are very commissionable and there is a structure there. I mean, one of the reasons why they picked the growing child was that it's flexible at point of delivery. So even though it does have the structure of an evidence-based program, there's still a lot of professional judgment and flexibility to meet families' needs. And I'm not sure that everything's like that. You know, that it's a big issue.
Okay, we better leave it there.